Welcome back to James Buchanan's The Doctrine of Justification. In this episode, we continue as we move into Lecture 3, which asks the critical question, was justification by faith alone a Reformation novelty or a long-standing doctrine defended through the centuries? And as we work our way through Lecture 3, we answer that by journeying through the voices of the Church Fathers, looking at names like Irenaeus, Augustine, Anselm, Bernard, and we conclude by watching the medieval church swap imputed righteousness for inherited merit and set the stage for Rome's coming corruption. Part 1, what did the church fathers actually teach? Buchanan begins by exposing a common myth, quote, that the doctrine of justification by grace through faith was unknown for 14 years before Luther was not so. He writes, it was never universally received. It was always opposed by the spirit of self-righteousness, but it was then, as it is now, the doctrine of many true believers and the very joy and rejoicing of their hearts. Many fathers clearly distinguish faith from works and justification by God's grace from man's merit. He quotes Bernard of Clairvaux, quote, so far from being able to answer for my sins, I cannot answer even for my righteousness, unquote. That one quote alone could have been posted on the Wittenberg door. Buchanan points to scholars like Downham, Davenant, Usher O'Brien, Faber, Bennett, who've traced a golden thread through the centuries. One example, Faber alone compiled support from 16 early fathers before the mid-5th century. This is William Frederick Faber. Buchanan doesn't give his background. He's a Roman Catholic convert, and Buchanan's quoting him here as an example within the Roman Catholic tradition of one that sees this doctrine of justification by faith in the early fathers. Usher, Buchanan alludes to, citing 12 more examples in the earlier seasons. Every century down to Bernard had its witnesses. The Protestant doctrine wasn't invented, it was remembered. Part 2, witnesses through the centuries. Buchanan looks at various testimonies like Irenaeus, quote, as through the disobedience of one man many were made sinners, so it behooved us also that through the obedience of one many should be justified. He ties justification not to human effort, but to Christ's obedience. Cyprian wrote, quote, each one who believes in God and lives by faith is found to be a righteous person, justified, unquote. Athanasius, not by works, but by faith a man is justified, as was Abraham. It can be blotted out through no other than through the Son of God, unquote. Basil, quote, he had known himself to be wanting in true righteousness and to be justified by faith alone in Christ, unquote. Ambrose, through faith alone an ungodly man is justified with God. Origen, the thief was justified through his confession alone. Jerome, God justifies him through faith alone, not on account of good works which he possessed not. Chrysostom, when we are justified, not by works, but by grace, where all sin is made to vanish away. Augustine, good works follows after a justified person. They do not go before, in order that he may be justified. Grace is given unto thee, not wages paid to thee. And then Anselm, preparing the dying for eternity, quote, place thy trust in no other thing. Cover thyself wholly with Christ's death. I offer his merits for my own, unquote. And then Bernard, the last of the fathers, our righteousness is but a filthy rag. Being justified by faith alone, he shall have peace with God. These men, Buchanan says, didn't all speak with equal clarity, but their consensus over time is unmistakable. Justification was by grace through faith in Christ alone. Now, of course, all of those citations have long been subject to debate as to the proper interpretation. That's a different video for another time. Buchanan doesn't interact with the responses to his use of those patristic writings. Part 3, when philosophy replaced faith. Despite the testimonies just mentioned, Buchanan warns, quote, the doctrine of a free justification was obscured and corrupted at a very early period. Human additions to divine truth crept in gradually and insensibly. The Church Fathers held the truth, but over time tradition gave way to systematized error, a shift from gospel proclamation to philosophical speculation. That's where the scholastics entered, according to Buchanan. Quote, "The scholastic theology attempted to explain the doctrine of the church by the philosophy of the schools." Unquote. Aristotle, filtered through Islamic philosophers, replaced apostolic doctrine. And since Aristotle knew no righteousness but personal virtue, the church's understanding of justification was flipped. No longer was it about imputed righteousness, Christ's perfect record counted to the sinner. Now it was about inherent righteousness, the infused moral quality within the soul. Part 4, the three fatal errors of scholasticism. Buchanan identifies three specific errors born from this philosophical system. 1, grace as infused power, not divine favor. Quote, justifying grace was no longer a status declared by God, but a substance infused into the soul. Number 2, works as meritorious. Good works weren't evidence of faith. They were the conditions of pardon, the currency to buy God's favor. And 3, works of supererogation. Quote, some saints did so many good deeds they earned extra merit, which the church could distribute to others, especially through indulgences. Buchanan calls it, quote, the irony of the devil, quoting even the mild Melanchthon. In short, quote, scholasticism contained the germs of popery, and popery was just scholasticism full-blown. And then in conclusion of Lecture 3, Buchanan made his case clear. The doctrine of forensic justification was not new. It was taught, sometimes clearly, sometimes dimly, by believers from Irenaeus to Bernard. But over time, truth was corrupted, and the gospel submerged under human merit and superstition. The Reformation, then, was not a revolt, it was a rescue. It was a rescue of sola fide from beneath the rubble of Rome. Quote, the doctrine of justification, by grace through faith, was not a novelty introduced by Luther and Calvin. It was and remains the only refuge of awakened sinners and humble penitents. And here lies the critical point of historical theology. Despite all of these testimonies, there was no formalized, conciliar definition of the doctrine of justification in the Western Church until the Council of Trent, which comes much later in 1545 to 1563, which condemned the very doctrine these ancient witnesses support. That's obviously significant. The early and medieval church was never uniform on justification, and the lack of dogmatic consensus before Trent reveals how fluid and how vulnerable the doctrine was to distortion. The fathers were not systematic theologians in the Reformed sense. Many of them contradicted themselves, and over time, this doctrinal ambiguity paved the way for the merit-centered theology of scholasticism, and finally Rome's anathematizing of the gospel. So Buchanan's point stands with sobering clarity. Quote, it proves beyond all controversy the fact that the Protestant doctrine of justification by grace through faith was not a novelty introduced into the church by Luther and Calvin, but was held and taught by some of the greatest writers in every successive age. Yet it took the formal errors of Trent to make the contrast unmistakably clear. Before Trent, the church had testimonies. After Trent, it had decrees, but they were the wrong ones. Justification by faith was not officially defined until it was denied. But long before Rome canonized its errors, saints and sinners across the centuries clung to this doctrine as their only hope. So that completes Lecture 3. We'll transition next time to Lecture 4, History of the Doctrine at the Era of the Reformation. This is James Buchanan, The Doctrine of Justification.